Welcome to Arise America. I'm Sheila Mcvicar. He's listening, he's tweeting, and he's talking about arming teachers. After yesterday's emotional outpouring from survivors of the Parkland school massacre, the president convened another meeting today on school safety. He told educators he is looking into improving background checks and raising the age for gun purchasing. He also says he wants to reopen mental institutions, but he says a top priority is putting guns into the hands of teachers.
We have to harden our schools, not soften them up. A gun-free zone to a killer or somebody that wants to be a killer, that's like going in for the ice cream. That's like, here I am, take me. We have to get smart on gun-free zones. When they see it says this is a gun-free zone, that means that nobody has a gun except them. Nobody's going to be shooting bullets in the other direction. And they see that as such a beautiful target. They live for gun-free zones.
Joining us now from Washington, Arise chief political correspondent Eric Ham. Eric, President Trump doubled down today, repeating his assertion that arming some teachers would be a deterrent for school shootings, and he praised the top leadership of the National Rifle Association as great American patriots. His solution to the problem of guns seems to be more guns.
It does, and he's doubling down on it. Now, the problem is when you look at his budget and that he proposed, as well as the budget that was signed by this president, we just don't see the resources to actually adequately fund such a policy proposal. Not only is it not feasible from a public policy standpoint, but I just think politically it would be disastrous, because you would see many of the teachers union, I think, balk at something like this.
Well, he, along with Florida Senator Marco Rubio, have talked about raising the limit on gun purchases to 21 from 18. That's a measure that, while limited, would seem to have some support, though certainly not from the NRA. Is that doable?
From a public policy standpoint, absolutely. From a political standpoint, I think it'd be a death knell for both this president as well as any member of the GOP who would actually support such a measure. We do know that the NRA has spoken out today, and they've spoken out loudly, saying that this is not something that they do support, which begs the question, what are they actually getting for the $30 million that they invested in this president, if he's actually now pushing and proposing proposals that go counter to the NRA?
Kind of an unusual statement today, saying that despite what Trump says on things like raising the age limit, his position hasn't changed. So is this a not so subtle reminder to the president of, first, what the organization wants, and then second, what they think his base wants?
Well, again, I think what we're seeing is a president who is at odds both with his base and with his gut instinct. And again, this goes back to, if we just look at the debate that took place over immigration. Initially, the president said he wanted a bill of love, and that he would take the hit for members of his own party for supporting such a proposal. But then, as the rubber met the road and as the policy details came to fruition, we saw the president cut and run. And so I think you're seeing that take place today. Again, yesterday he mentioned he wanted to see guns in schools, and then today he sent out a tweet saying that that's not what he proposed. So again, I think many people don't know where this president stands on this issue, and I think if we begin to see a debate on guns, particularly in the Congress, much like what we've seen on DACA and other issues such as Obamacare, I think you will see the president on the sidelines.
Well, just to go to the question of Senator Marco Rubio, last night he was loudly booed at that CNN town hall when he rejected the idea of an assault weapons ban. As you watched that event, as a matter of fact, you could almost watch the wheels turning as he tried to calibrate the sentiment in the room. And he did appear to shift his position somewhat, talking about maybe a ban on larger size magazines, maybe supporting the increased age. Are we going to see Rubio come out and strongly advocate for real gun reform?
Well, we have to keep in mind, Marco Rubio has actually received more than $3 million from the NRA. And I don't think it's out of the realm to suggest that if he should decide to move against the NRA's positions, that we could see someone who's more conservative run against him. Now, he's not up for re-election in 2018, but he will be up for re-election in 4 years. And so I think that's something that he has to keep an eye on. So I don't think he will actually move as far as many would like to see him on this issue. And again, if he decided to, the president has spoken in favor of these similar proposals, but we just know that oftentimes the president can and will shift his position. So I don't, and I think we've seen that for Marco Rubio as well. So again, I think Marco Rubio did a lot of dancing last night, and I think he's willing to just leave it at that.
Well, we know that to a certain extent, no matter what the president says he wants, the rubber really does meet the road up on Capitol Hill. What's the GOP leadership saying about this? Is gun reform, even small changes to gun legislation, are those at the top of the legislative agenda?
Right now, no. When the Congress returns next week, the major issue will be how to address the issue of DACA. Remember, the deadline for the Dreamers is March 5th, and so that's going to be front and center for members of Congress when they return next week. Also, because the issue of gun control and the debate is so fraught politically for both parties now, I think moving into the midterms and now with a potential blue wave forming, I think this is not a fight, not a battle that neither side would like to see. And so I don't think you're going to see either Majority Leader McConnell or Speaker of the House Paul Ryan actually look to aggressively address this issue. You know,
I have to ask this question. Are elected officials, senators, congressmen, are they afraid of the power of the NRA?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. In fact, I think particularly members of Congress from blue states, I think when they look at this issue, they do see shades of 1994, where there was an assault weapons ban that passed, and we saw members of the Democratic Party take a hit for that. And so I think that's a concern that they have. Also, if you look at the electoral map right now, and in the Senate, you have many of senators from red state, Democratic senators from red states actually defending far more seats than Republicans. And so I think many Democrats are not going to want to see people like Senator John Tester or Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia or Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota take very difficult votes, considering that these are vulnerable Democrats in states that were overwhelmingly won by President Trump. So I think this is an issue that many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle will want to stay away from. It could be the potential kryptonite for both parties.
Well, it'll be interesting as we get closer to that March on Washington that's planned for the 24th, organized by those students from Parkland. Thanks so much, Eric Ham. Thank you. Police who responded to the Parkland shooting revealed today that security cameras in the school were not live, but on a 26-minute delay, leading officers to believe the shooter was still in the school and they were heading into a firefight. The captain of the Coral Gable Police Department insisted the picture delay did not increase the number of casualties, but did hamper the search to locate the gunman. While police believed he was heading from the second to third floors of the school, he had actually left the building nearly half an hour earlier, had bought a drink at a local Subway store, and was at Walmart. Officials are now investigating why the cameras were on a delay. The Broward County Sheriff's Department issued an order yesterday saying that deputies protecting schools will now carry rifles, including AR-15s. The order has the support of the local school superintendent. And a gun show scheduled for next month in Fort in Broward County. Today, the CEO of the National Rifle Association, Wayne LaPierre, finally spoke out in the aftermath of the Parkland shooting. His fiery defense of existing gun laws that make it easy for almost anyone to buy weapons comes after days of emotional calls for stricter laws. The NRA is the leading lobby organization for the gun industry. As Arise's Duarte Geraldino reports, LaPierre argued the best way to stop future school shooters is to get even more legal guns into the hands of so-called good guys.
It doesn't make sense. Fix it. It should have been one school shooting, and we should have fixed it. And I'm pissed, because my daughter I'm not going to see again. She's not here. She's not here. She's in North Lauderdale at whatever it is, King David Cemetery. That's where I go to see my kid now. And it stops. We all work together.
Since the 1999 Columbine High School massacre, there have been more than 200 school shootings in America, resulting in at least 141 fatalities, according to the FBI. Sobering statistics. The families and victims are now calling for stricter gun laws that would require mental health screenings, age restrictions, and a host of other checks designed to prevent another tragedy. At a CNN town hall meeting, Florida Senator Marco Rubio tried to explain to families why new laws might not be the solution.
Now, I think what you're asking about is the assault weapons ban.
Yes, sir.
So let me be honest with you about that one. If I believed that that law would have prevented this from happening, I would support it. But I want to explain to you why it would not.
Senator Rubio, my daughter, running down the hallway at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, were shot in the back with an assault weapon, the weapon of choice.
Yes, sir.
Okay? It is too easy to get. It is a weapon of war. The fact that you can't stand with everybody in this building and say that, I'm sorry.
Sir, I do believe what you're saying is true.
Today, the executive director of the influential National Rifle Association aggressively pushed back, laying blame for the attack on the FBI, the mental health system, and security at schools.
As usual, the opportunist wasted not 1 second to exploit tragedy for political gain. Saul Alinsky would have been proud. The breakback speed of calls for more gun control laws, and the breathless national media eager to smear the NRA.
LaPierre suggests fortifying America's hundreds of thousands of schools, similar to federal buildings and sporting arenas.
We must immediately harden our schools. Every day, young children are being dropped off at schools that are virtually wide open, soft targets for anyone bent on mass murder. It should not be easier for a madman to shoot up a school than a bank or a jewelry store or some Hollywood gala.
He argued the call for more gun control is part of a bigger attack on American freedoms.
For them, it's not a safety issue, it's a political issue. They care more about control and more of it. Their goal is to eliminate the Second Amendment and our firearms freedoms so they can eradicate all individual freedoms. So lean in, listen to me now, and never forget these words. To stop a bad guy with a gun, it takes a good guy with a gun. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, according to U.S. Secret Service data, about 68% of all school shooters from 1999 until the present didn't actually buy the weapon that they used. They got them from family or from home. So any reform of existing gun laws has to look at the much bigger picture and not just focus on the point of purchase, Sheila.
So Duarte, if 68% of these school shooters didn't buy their weapons and therefore didn't go through any kind of background check, however weak or broad that check might have been, that seems to leave the onus on family, schools, and others to report any suspicions that they have. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's what's bubbling right now. In fact, according also to the Secret Service, in about 81% of these cases, someone had verifiable information that an attack was imminent.
So I want to go to a tweet that came out from Marco Rubio. We saw him there sort of struggling at last night's town hall, though he was there. This tweet sent this morning read, "Banning all semi-automatic weapons may have been popular with the audience at #CNTownHall, but it is a position well outside the mainstream." Just how outside the mainstream is an assault weapons ban?
Not quite outside the mainstream. In fact, there are 3 polls that speak to this. The first one is the Morning Consult political poll that says about 2/3 of Americans actually support stricter gun laws. And then we could turn to the Quinnipiac University poll that says about 67%, Sheila, support a ban on assault weapons. And then finally, there's the Washington Post ABC News poll that says that about 62% of voters surveyed don't believe that President Trump is doing enough in light of this latest tragedy.
So there seems to be some change in public opinion just in the course of the last few days.
Indeed.
Duarte Geraldino, thanks so much for joining us. Our Rise News correspondent, Akisa Omulapu, has been taking a look at how teachers, their unions and associations have been reacting to President Trump's plan to arm teachers. Akisa, tell us what you found.
What I found was that overwhelmingly teachers' unions and teachers have rejected this idea of arming teachers. It's important to know that pedagogy is a profession. People go to a schooling to get advanced degrees in pedagogy, and the idea that lawmakers would suggest they should buy guns to protect their students is seen as a disrespectful move.
There was a statement that came out earlier today from the NEA president, one of the teachers' unions, and she said bringing more guns into our schools does nothing to protect our students and educate us from gun violence. Our students need more books, art, and music programs, nurses and school counselors. They do not need more guns in their classrooms. Is that, do you think, the sentiment that we are going to hear broadly from teachers' organizations and teachers across the country?
I do believe across the board that will be the overwhelming sentiment. Of course, everyone won't agree with that sentiment, but overwhelmingly people will agree that they are professionals. And the idea that they should suddenly learn how to arm themselves as opposed to teaching students and creating spaces and environments of safe learning spaces kind of goes against what they're trained to do.
You actually were a teacher for a number of years.
Yes.
And could you just put yourself in that situation where you have a very chaotic event taking place and you have someone in your school with a gun perhaps, and then you have a number of other people who have guns. What do you think happens?
Yes, I was a teacher for 8 years here in New York City in the South Bronx. I was a math teacher in the day and a professor at night. And the idea that I would have to wrangle 32 to 35 students, teenagers, in the midst of a class and then pull out a gun is a little ridiculous to me. And it's important to note that our school safety officers go through great lengths to ensure school safety. And the idea that when I was a teacher of arming myself, I couldn't even imagine it. It's important to note as well, I was a union rep for the United Federation of Teachers as well. And overwhelmingly teachers believe pedagogy is a profession that should be taken seriously.
So we know that teachers are often underfunded, or schools are often underfunded, and that in some jurisdictions, as a matter of fact, teachers are buying their own school supplies out of their own pockets because there simply is not the money. So when we hear the NRA CEO or President Trump talking about hardening schools, more security, more cameras, more surveillance, more guns, more all of that, where's the money going to come from?
I don't know. I don't think that was well thought out. But more importantly, going back to creating environments of learning. What are we creating if we are trying to create schools that are actually modeled after prisons? Schools should be a place where lofty ideas are explored, where ideas with your peers are explored, as opposed to lockdown facilities where no exploration takes place. So it's a very troubling idea.
Akisa, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Throughout his remarks, the NRA's LaPierre repeatedly referred to background check legislation authored and promoted by his organization and claimed Democrats and those who supported better gun control wanted to, quote, eliminate the Second Amendment and our firearms freedom so they can eliminate all individual freedoms. So Take a listen to this from the now former police chief of Milwaukee, Edward Flynn, as he talks about the impact of NRA-authored legislation on his city.
It's an irresponsible law passed by irresponsible legislatures who are more interested in ideological points than saving lives, and I'd sure as hell like some more community outreach about that, because that's what's driving the violence in this city, and too many public officials are silent on it.
Legendary preacher Billy Graham will lie in honor at the U.S. Capitol next week. Private citizens are seldom honored in this way. The last one to receive this honor was civil rights hero Rosa Parks. Reverend Graham died yesterday at his home in Asheville, North Carolina, at the age of 99. While many dignitaries are expected to attend his funeral on March 3rd, his casket has a humble origin. The Reverend asked inmates at Louisiana State Penitentiary to build it for him many, many years ago. The prison at Angola, called the Alcatraz of the South, is the home of a renowned prison ministry. Coming up next, a political leader with a very special perspective on the power of young people to make change. She marched for civil rights as a child in 1963. You're watching Arise America. Support for protesting students in Parkland, Florida continued to garner more support. President Obama tweeted today saying, "Young people have helped lead all our great movements. How inspiring to see it again in so many smart, fearless students standing up for their right to be safe, marching and organizing to remake the world as it should be. We've been waiting for you, and we've got your backs." This is not the first time in the history of the United States that young people, teenagers, and those even younger have been powerful agents of change. That was never more clearly seen than in 1963 in racially segregated, racially divided Birmingham, Alabama. In May of that year, civil rights activists, including Dr. Martin Luther King, launched the Children's Crusade. The goal was to use the tactics of nonviolent protest to provoke civic and business leaders of Birmingham to agree to desegregate. C. Virginia Fields is the former Manhattan Borough president and participated in student protests in Birmingham during the civil rights struggle. She's here to share her story. Ms. Fields, thank you so much.
Thank you.
How old were you in 1963 and what were you doing?
At that time, because of overcrowded in schools and, you know, we had segregated schools, we had graduations in January and we had graduations in May. So I had graduated in January of 63 and I marched with Dr. King in April of 63, the only march that he led in Birmingham on Good Friday.
What was the atmosphere in the city like at that time?
Oh, as you can well imagine, it was very tense, but people were ready. People were committed. I think it was Andrew Young's book when he said he never saw a group of people so ready as they found them in Birmingham. And having lived in Birmingham all of my life under segregated conditions, going to stores where you could not go into dressing rooms, could not sit down at counters to eat, had to stand up and eat your hot dog no matter how hungry you were. So being through that and seeing my church and my pastor, who was Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, living only a stone's throw from the church, feeling the impact of 3 bombings of that church, and seeing he and his family beaten when he tried to integrate schools. There was no fear of marching. You almost felt that you had to. It was your time had come, not knowing the outcome, but you were ready, and I was among those who were ready.
You were a teenager,
yes,
but you were going up against the forces of Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor,
yes,
who was notorious for his violence and for his ruthlessness.
He was a mean man, no question about it. And of course, George Wallace was the governor. So between the two of them, they meant no good for colored people. And he, of course, came out with the dogs. I was one hit by the fire hose, and the pain of being hit by a fire hose is something I hope no one ever has to experience. But I was arrested on Good Friday and ended up spending 6 days in jail.
How was that?
It was horrific. It was horrible. It was in April, and the heat was turned on by day, and the air conditioned by night. We were on iron carts with the little round pegs and no mattress. But of course, we learned a lot of this after the fact, that Mrs. Keene had contacted President Kennedy to complain about the conditions of her husband, who was in jail at the same time, and the other of the rest of us.
Where he was writing a letter from a Birmingham jail.
He wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail at the time I was in there. So all of this was happening, of course, learned it later. But the conditions were horrible. They did all kinds of things to intimidate us, like they might call you out and we would say, oh great, you're going home, let our families know we're okay. But they were only moving you to another cell with regular prisoners, and you were intimidated maybe for a couple of days, terrified, brought back into the cell. So everything was done.
Can I ask, how did your parents deal with this?
My mother dealt with it fine. My father had passed, and my mother was a leader in the community. She was one of the civil rights leaders, and so at the youngest of 5 children, other 2 sisters were in college, my brother was working, and he was very concerned about me marching because he was in education and fearful of losing his job and his wife's job. But my mother was okay. She was my champion. She was a leader in the community, and I was there representing. My mother, my father, my sisters, my ancestors, my grandparents, she was fine with it.
And was there a point in time where you actually confronted Bull Connor?
Yes, there was a time when we were out marching and they had filled the playground, the ballparks. All of the jails were filled. There was no more spaces to just lock up anybody. So this particular Sunday, lots of us were still out there marching, demonstrating. So we marched to this park, and we had been instructed, because we were always given lessons on nonviolence. That was the key. We were to fall to our knees when confronted. We were confronted that Sunday, and Bull Connor was there telling the firemen to turn the hose on us, and the dogs snaring at us, and we were very fearful, so we fell on our knees. He came and stood there because he felt they were not moving fast enough, and he tried to turn on that hose, and I tell you, he pulled it, nothing came out. And he was like about as close now to me as I'm to you. And for those of us, certainly, who were very much concerned, and our spiritual faith kicked in, we knew that God was on our side. Nothing came out of those water hoses.
Can I ask you what comes into your mind when you see the young people of Parkland standing up, either articulating what they think should happen, or going to their legislators and telling them what the change they want to see, walking out of their schools? What goes through your mind?
I am so encouraged by that, and I support them 100%. I am delighted to see this level of engagement and to hearing them speak out on something that is so incredibly important, because you remember also back in the early 60s, it was the students in North Carolina who sat at those lunch counters who really led the pathway to a lot of the civil rights demonstrations and marches that led to the desegregation of public facilities. So seeing that and knowing the history of that, and seeing these students now pretty much taking that same path, I'm encouraged, because we know change is possible through those kind of activities.
But you know that the road to change is hard, and so what's the one piece of advice you would give them?
Stick to it. Don't give up, and pull more people into the process. Those of us who've been through it, those who are going through it now, and we are much more powerful working together. But don't be discouraged, because it can look sometimes that nothing is moving, but don't give up.
C. Virginia Fields, thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Checking the U.S. markets at the close, the Dow was up 164 points, NASDAQ was down 8, and the S&P wound up just under 3 points. Takeda is settling with 44 state attorneys general in a case related to its faulty airbags. The $650 million civil penalty will go to consumer victims rather than state coffers. At least 22 deaths are blamed on airbags exploding rather than protecting people during accidents. For more business news, here's Arise correspondent Duarte Geraldino.
Slower growth in production industries is being blamed for a downsizing of the UK's economy. The Office for National Statistics revised the United Kingdom's fourth quarter 2017 GDP. It grew less than expected. The growth rate for the year was 1.7% overall. Bloomberg News is reporting the Florida Teachers Pension Fund actually invested in the company that manufactures the rifle used in the Parkland school shooting. The most recent filing indicates teachers hold more than $500,000 in American outdoor stock. Sexual harassment at Ford Motor Company in Chicago is making news. Women from two plants told city leaders they had been groped, called fresh meat, and shown photos of male workers' genitals. Their testimony comes one day after Ford's North American president, Raj Nair, was dismissed for inappropriate behavior. The U.S. women's hockey gold medal is shining extra brightly. Not only was their win against Canada a surprise, but these women also stuck together to successfully fight for economic parity with the men's hockey team. They fought and won equal per diem pay and equal equipment. Financial innovation under the sea. In the Seychelles, two huge underwater marine parks are being developed. They're part of a deal called Debt for Dolphins. The Nature Conservancy and Leonardo DiCaprio are among those paying down some of the country's national debt in exchange for the parks. The goal is to protect marine life from the ravages of climate change.
3, 2, 1.
And finally, SpaceX does it again. This morning, its two-stage Falcon 9 rocket lifted off and delivered 3 payloads into orbit. 2 were for the company's Starlink satellite internet constellation. The third is a Spanish radar imaging spacecraft. Those are your business headlines. For Arise News, I'm Duarte Geraldino.
Just ahead, a new round of charges from Special Counsel Mueller in the Russia investigation. You're watching Arise America. The next round of charges from Special Counsel Robert Mueller have just been filed late today. Former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort and his business partner Rick Gates were charged in a new 32-count indictment that includes tax charges. This is in addition to a 12-count indictment handed down in October. A security scare for Britain's Prince Harry and his fiancée Meghan Markle. Police are investigating an envelope containing a letter and white powder sent to the couple at St. James Palace. It arrived last week just before they set off for a trip to Scotland. The envelope was intercepted before they opened it, and the powder was found to be harmless. But the letter made racially charged remarks about Ms. Markle, whose mother is African American. The Evening Standard reports the couple has been informed about the incident. They're due to be wed in May. To Syria now, where the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says more than 400 people have been killed and 2,000 wounded in airstrikes since Sunday. In the besieged Damascus suburb of eastern Ghouta, this marks one of the bloodiest periods in the 6-year-old civil war. As bombing continued again today, doctors in the rebel-held district described a collapsing health system with few resources and gravely wounded patients left to die. The UN humanitarian coordinator for Syria said families were without food, water, or electricity in the winter cold, and in one town, 80% of the population was now living underground. Today, Russia blocked a United Nations Security Council proposal for a 30-day ceasefire that would allow for the delivery of humanitarian aid and the evacuation of the wounded and critically ill. It's a measure the International Red Cross is asking for urgently.
By what we see happening now in eastern Ghouta, and we fear that the situation will worsen. And I hope I'm mistaken here. So many have been stunned into silence by the atrocity of the unwarranted violence towards civilians, but we will use our words. No civilian is or should be a tool of war, and we must have immediate humanitarian access.
Joining us now to discuss this latest violence and possible outcomes is James Paul, author of Syria Unmasked and former executive director of the Middle East Research and Information Project. Thank you so much, Mr. Paul. We've had this series of airstrikes, terrible airstrikes in eastern Ghouta. Why is the regime going at eastern Ghouta at this time?
I think it's quite likely that the regime is planning a ground attack on eastern Ghouta. This is one of the few remaining regions that is held by rebel forces, and this is a softening up process, just as we saw, for instance, in Aleppo some months back when the big offensive there took place. And there was a very, very similar process where the UN called for ceasefire, either a short time or a longer term ceasefire. There was arguments between the Russians and also very, very serious negotiation between the Russians and the Americans about whether or not that could go forward. So this is where we're at now.
So you basically think we're seeing a rerun of Aleppo, where they are going to essentially bomb into submission, get to a ceasefire, which will allow the extraction of at least some civilians.
That's right. Oh, well, certainly there'll be many civilians who will be able to leave, as there was in Aleppo.
Because the population is 400,000 plus.
Yes. So, but however, that's not to minimize the very, very serious humanitarian crisis there, and the many people who've been killed, wounded, without medical assistance and all the rest of it.
Well, the UN put out a statement earlier saying literally that they had run out of words with regards to the conditions in eastern Ghouta, and this is a population that has been facing terrible conditions for 6 years now.
Yes. In fact, however, we see in other areas of the Middle East, we see similar terrible things that have happened. For example, the battle over Mosul in northern Iraq, which was a U.S.-led operation, and also involved a bombardment from the air, from the ground, and so on, and also terrible consequences for the civilian population. Another one is in Yemen, where the Saudi-led coalition, which also has support from the United States, has been, and there's 7 million people on the verge of starvation. So this really, I think we see terrible things happening in the Middle East.
Why would Russia today work to block that ceasefire resolution?
Well, I would say probably what their official position is that there are various terrorist groups inside of that area, inside of East Ghouta, that are related to Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups in Syria, and that those should be attacked, and legitimately should be attacked, following agreements with the United States and others. And they want to include some of that in the resolution. Now, whether or not that's a reasonable idea is not what I'm talking about here, but that's, I think, the Russian position. And I think that there's some hope that the Russians, that it could be the resolution, because the resolution was not vetoed. It was blocked by a threat of veto, and they've gone back to negotiations. It's quite possible that there might be a positive outcome for this. That would be the hope.
You know, for months now, we've seen these on-off again talks between all the parties taking place, mostly in Geneva.
Yeah.
But they seem to take place at a time when it's convenient for the parties, mostly convenient for Russia, and they seem also to end with very little result. Is that your sense of what's happening in that process?
It is, but I think the question is, who are the people that should be talking, and who might represent the people of the country vis-a-vis the regime. And the United States and its allies have, including Saudi Arabia, have put together a group of what are called the opposition, that is not really properly representative of the people. Staffan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy, has been trying to organize this, but he's under pressure also to accept certain groups. I'm very close to some other people within Syria that are the really democratic and nonviolent opposition, and they have a very broad support in the country. But the United States and the Western allies are not ready to talk with them. Curiously, I was with them when they were talking to people down at the UN, and they just didn't want to talk to them, whereas they wanted to be going with the Saudi-led group, some of whom were, you know, very close to terrorist organizations. So you have a very strange business going on. And we have to bear that in mind when we look at this.
James Paul, thank you so much for coming in and talking with us.
Nice to be with you.
When we return, we'll talk about why HIV is still a particular threat for African Americans. You're watching Arise America. According to the CDC, more than 1 million people are living with HIV and AIDS in the United States. But the rates of infection continue to disproportionately impact the African American community. Joining us again is C. Virginia Fields. She's the president of the National Black Leadership Commission on AIDS. Thank you so much for staying around to talk with us about this. So the rates of infection are higher in the African American community. Why?
I think a number of factors attribute to that as we do our work. And as you said, I'm the president of the National Black Leadership Commission on AIDS, and our mission is to educate, mobilize, and empower black leaders to really be involved in their local communities, not only with HIV/AIDS, but other health disparities. We still have problems of stigma. We have problems of homophobia. We have problems due to the lack of education and information. And in our work, we do a lot in terms of trying to just educate the community. There's a sense of complacency, and especially, I think, since Magic Johnson, you know, appears to be healthy and living with AIDS, and people, but he's the first to tell them they don't know what he has to go through.
Right.
HIV is preventable, but there still is no cure. So when we look at stigma, lack of treatment, even though treatment is care, over the last 30 years or so, there have been tremendous, you know, advancements as it relates to antiretroviral treatment and so forth. But African Americans are not staying in treatment as long to keep their viral load suppressed.
Why is that? Is that a financial issue? Is it access to care, access to medication?
I think it's a combination of all of the above, and talking with some of the people who are HIV, and they say they never get asked, but some of the things they say is unemployment, lack of housing, there are other issues that they have that are not being addressed. So staying in care has not been their primary focus, unfortunately.
How does your organization work to deal with those issues?
We do a lot in education, we do counseling, we do testing, and when we find someone who is positive, we certainly refer them to medical care for treatment or for further testing to confirm that they are positive, and encouraging them to stay in care. Our governor here in the state of New York about 3 years ago released a blueprint to significantly reduce new infections by 2020. And there are 3 parts to it: getting people tested, because we know if you get tested and you find out that you're positive and you stay in care, you can have a better quality of life. Getting people linked into care and keeping them in care so that they do not transmit the disease. And then the third piece is through education, pre-exposure prophylactins, which is a medication that a person can take a pill once a day. And if you are negative, you can remain negative, and of course it suggests that you still use, you know, condoms and other safe measures.
So there was a PSA, the PSA that we played just before we just started discussing this was for Truvada, which is one of those prophylaxis preventative drugs. But there was a story earlier this week in the New York Times about New York State investigators examining whether insurance companies, those that offer life insurance or disability risk insurance, were discriminating against people who were on Truvada, and there was a series of cases that they had. Are people that you know that are in your community, are they experiencing that kind of discrimination first? And second, is Truvada or PrEP really as effective as it's claimed to be?
No, they're not experiencing that. One of the problems we're seeing with PrEP in the black, gay, and black men who have sex with men communities is that they're not taking the medication, one, because of lack of information, information or awareness. We did a focus group in 5 cities throughout the state of New York, and that was one of the major things. They don't know about it.
Right.
Doctors are not prescribing it. They are not being referred even for it. So that's not an issue so much in this community. Cost, even though there's some assistance with in terms of paying for it. So that particular one is not so much a problem in this community.
But getting access to the drug itself, which could prevent further infection, is an issue.
It is definitely an issue, and that comes again from lack of awareness or even doctors not prescribing. It is shown that in this country, quite frankly, it's predominantly white gay men who are using predominantly PrEP. It is not black gay men or black men who have sex with men, and a lot of it is due to doctors not prescribing, or in some cases like upstate New York, there are not even any doctors who are prescribing at all. So one of the things my organization is doing is trying to reach out into the community and understand why, and on a regional level, making sure that there is access to it. So then you make a choice if you want to, go on the medication or not.
Steve Virginia Fields, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you, and thank you for this subject, because much more needs to be said about it.
Thank you. When we come back, artists on a mission to reclaim history. You're watching Arise America. It's a name people born in Cuba might not even know, Antonio Aponte. He led a rebellion of enslaved people on the island more than 200 years ago, and what makes his story even more remarkable is that he's believed to have created artwork about the uprising before it happened. That artwork was lost, but our guests are reimagining it for a new exhibit. Earlier, we spoke with Ada Ferrer. She's an historian with New York University, which is hosting the program, and co-curator and artist Edouard Duval-Carrier. Ada, as the historian of the project, let's begin. Who was Antonio Aponte?
Well, Jose Antonio Aponte was a free man of color, a free black man born in Havana, and he was a carpenter, an artisan. Many of the artisans in Havana in this period were black men, and he was also a member of the colonial militia. He was a reader, he was a creator, he was a thinker, and he led a movement against slavery with other free men of color and with enslaved people.
An uprising, essentially.
An uprising, a conspiracy, and they rose up. They were captured after the third plantation, but it was a much bigger conspiracy overall. They wanted to end slavery in all of Cuba. There were links possibly to eastern Cuba. Some say there were links to Santo Domingo and to Haiti, some even to Brazil. So he had an expansive vision, but it was defeated before it could really get started.
Edouard, tell us about what was in the book that he created, which sounds like an extraordinary work.
It's an extraordinary story. I read Ada's book on the reactions of the Spanish territories in the Caribbean to the Haitian Revolution, and a chapter was devoted to Jose Antonio Aponte. And the book has been lost, but there were the transcripts of the trial, because that's what really got started the whole situation with him. That when they found, I mean, they would have executed him immediately, but when they went to his house, they found a book of paintings, and the authorities were so curious that they really wanted to know what was in that book. And it's through the transcripts of those descriptions, because they went page to page to page, like describing every inch of the images. So when I read that, I found that so extraordinary, and that I had to meet her. I had to meet Ada. So I called her, and she was saying, I've been looking for this book. At one point I said, Ada, you know what, let's redo the book. Because there's enough material with these transcripts to imagine what, what he was trying to say, what he was trying to conceive, and really the book was meant for the King of Spain. It was like a letter or a document to be sent to the King of Spain to explain to the King of Spain who his subjects were, that they had a history, that they were people of dignity, etc., etc. And so it's literally a history of the black world.
So, Ada, what did these paintings depict? What were these works of art?
The first painting was a picture of the creation of Earth. So it's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. But in black.
Yes.
From the black perspective.
Yes. And then there are pictures of Havana. There are pictures of fortresses, of landmarks in Havana. There are pictures of his own grandfather, who was also a colonial militiaman fighting and defending Havana against foreign powers. Importantly, there were many images of Ethiopia. There were images,
a place he had never been to.
He had never been to. There were pictures of Egypt. There were pictures of Rome, of Spain, of the heavens. There were a lot of astrological
So these are images that he imagined and labeled them as this is Ethiopia, or this is my Rome. This is Rome as I see it.
Yes, he also read. So he had a library of books in his house with 12 books, and he had several histories of Ethiopia, I believe two histories of Ethiopia, a history of Rome, a guide to Havana. So he read widely and talked to people. And he had heard about Rome from two Cuban priests who went and saw black men saying the Mass. Black priests delivering the Mass in Rome. So he depicted that in his book.
We talked briefly about how he was using these images in his rebellion. How did he do that?
Well, they were also, he was concocting, for example, making reference to the Haitian Revolution. He was showing generals, like in battle with white forces.
We will never know, but it's fun to think about. So I think that they represent an image of black sovereignty. It's in an age, he's creating this right after the Haitian Revolution is
successful. And the pictures that you have made now, that your exhibit is made of, what do they represent?
What do they represent?
Well, we invited about 12 artists.
There's 14
now artists, and each one, some of them really went through great lengths to try to conceive what Aponte did. Others just, made homage to him. So it's a variety of things. For example, mine are very, I try to illustrate one or two of these paintings that they talk about in this transcript. I had to do 4 to try to encapsulate all that was said about those paintings. I just couldn't conceive of putting all of this information on one plate because they were very, very complex.
So these 14 different artists that you went to, you said to them, did you ask them, is there something in particular that speaks to you that you want to represent?
So everyone did it a little differently. We made the scholarship available to them and the transcript of the trial, and then they would just call and we'd talk to them. And so, for example, Teresita Fernandez, who's a Cuban-American artist who does a lot of landscape work, and she does very big, kind of large conceptual art. She likes working, she was working with gold. She was interested in his vision of the cosmos, because the cosmos are all over the book. So she did something that's much more abstract, more conceptual, but she tied it to one of the images where he talks about Vulcan and Jupiter, and one of them being on a mountaintop and sending rays of gold to his father. And so she was drawn to that and did something with that.
I know that you want to travel this exhibit. Yeah. We've got a little bit of time, just a very short amount of time. Yeah. Where are you taking the exhibit?
Well, it was in Miami, now it's in New York. Next it goes to Duke University. We've had interest from universities across the country, also from Havana, Santiago de Cuba,
and I'm
Haiti.
Definitely taking it to Haiti.
Yes, yes, yeah.
What's the most important thing people can take away with them?
I think a couple things. He was someone who was an artist and a revolutionary. To think about the future, you got to be creative and be imaginative.
Thank you so much for coming in to talk with us about this. The exhibit Visionary Aponte, Black Art and Freedom opens to the public tomorrow at New York University's King Juan Carlos Center. Thanks so much for watching Arise America in New York. I'm Sheila Mcvicar. We'll see you here tomorrow.